Let's begin here, because too many confuse attention with devotion. A man who sends a few texts is not the same as a man who builds a bond. Many women mistake convenience for care and politeness for love. This is not your fault. It is a pattern learned over years of being told to accept less than what you deserve. The shadow of loneliness whispers that crumbs are enough, and so you try to make a meal out of them. But the self knows better. The self hungers for reciprocity, for a connection that grows rather than drifts. And it is this difference between empty gestures and genuine presence that reveals whether a man is truly ready for you. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let us step deeper. The mistake lies in trusting words when actions tell another story. A man can be eloquent, even tender, in what he says, yet absent in how he shows up. Jung once wrote that you are what you do not, what you say you'll do. It is a simple truth. The psyche speaks through action. When communication remains lukewarm, when calls are avoided, when presence never deepens, the unconscious has already made its choice, and that choice is not you. Yet many women rationalize. They say, he is busy, he is shy, he just needs time. But time cannot create desire where none exists. Hope becomes a mask that hides reality, and the woman begins to negotiate against her own worth. Here, the persona of patience conceals the deeper wound, the fear of being unwanted. And so she accepts a half-life, believing it is better than solitude. But solitude is not the enemy. In fact, solitude is the crucible of individuation. It is in solitude that a woman reclaims her standard, remembers her essence, and refuses to be reduced to fragments of attention. What many fear as emptiness is actually a doorway, the threshold between repeating an old pattern and stepping into self-respect. To recognize lukewarm affection as illusion is the first act of courage. It is the moment when the shadow is named and the heart begins to clear. This is where our journey begins, with the difference between being entertained and being chosen. One is a performance, the other a commitment. One keeps you waiting, the other draws you closer. And in knowing the difference, you protect your soul from wasting its light on those who cannot carry it. The first fractures in a connection rarely appear as dramatic breaks. They come quietly in small patterns that seem harmless at first, but reveal a deeper truth. A message delayed a call, avoided an excuse repeated. These are the earliest signals that a bond is not truly forming. At the surface, the gestures may even feel polite. He writes, just checking in, or hope you had a good day. Yet there is no depth behind the words, no desire to hear the details, no movement toward real intimacy. The communication circles endlessly around trivial ground, never entering the inner landscape where love grows. Here is where many women hesitate. They tell themselves that patience is kindness, that giving space is maturity. But patience without progress becomes tolerance of neglect. And tolerance over time corrodes self-respect. Jung taught that what we do not make conscious will return as fate. If we ignore these early cracks, they expand until they define the whole relationship. The fracture deepens when the past is allowed to linger. A man who remains tied to an ex carries divided energy. Even if he insists it is harmless, the emotional thread is still alive. This leaves the woman not as a partner, but as a placeholder. She waits in a shadowed corridor, wondering if he will choose her or return to what came before. That uncertainty is not love, it is limbo. Notice how the mask works here. The persona of the reasonable man explains the contact with his ex as friendly, civilized, mature. But behind that mask is indecision. And indecision is itself a decision. It says, "You are not my priority." When a woman accepts this, she is pulled into the same shadow. She begins to believe that being second choice is better than being alone. Another fracture comes through broken promises. Plans are made, then canceled. A date is arranged, then postponed. The words, "something came up," become a familiar refrain. At first, she forgives, remembering that life is unpredictable. But when this pattern repeats, it is not chance. It is a lack of respect for her time, her presence, her life. Every canceled meeting carries a message. It says, "You are not essential." And when she quietly accepts this message, she risks weaving it into her own self-image. The unconscious begins to agree. Perhaps I am not essential. In this way, the fracture spreads inward. What begins as his neglect becomes her own diminished sense of worth. The next crack is subtler, but just as painful: invisibility. When she is kept apart from his family, from his circle of friends, from the people who shape his world, she becomes a figure hidden in the shadows. He may say the timing is not right, or that circumstances are complicated, but what he is really protecting is his freedom to walk away without leaving traces. To be excluded in this way is to be told, "I am not building a future with you." And then there is the silent wall of the closed heart. Even after weeks or months, the conversations remain on safe ground. Whether television schedules, perhaps physical attraction. But the soul never enters the exchange. No fears, no dreams, no confessions of vulnerability. She is invited to share her heart, but his remains behind locked doors. This is not intimacy, it is performance. Each of these fractures may seem small: a lukewarm message, a postponed date, a closed heart. But together they carry a heavy weight. They form a pattern of absence, a structure of distance that no amount of effort from her side can bridge. And yet many women persist, telling themselves that with enough patience the cracks will close. But cracks do not close on their own. They widen until the whole foundation collapses. Jung compared this to the splitting of the psyche. What is repressed returns as shadow. Here, what is ignored in the relationship returns as disillusionment. The woman who once hoped for depth wakes one day to find herself stranded in shallow waters, giving endlessly but never truly receiving. Why do so many accept this? Because the fear of solitude casts a long shadow. To walk away feels like entering emptiness, while to remain at least offers the comfort of familiarity. Yet this is the illusion: to stay in such a fractured bond is to be alone in the presence of another. It is a loneliness sharper than solitude itself. The first fracture is not only in the relationship, it is also in the soul. Each neglected call, each broken promise, each closed door reflects back to her the question, will I betray myself by staying here? This is the true wound, not his absence, but her temptation to accept it. It is at this point that many begin to live a double life. Outwardly, they maintain the appearance of patience, grace, even gratitude. But inwardly, they feel restless, unseen, unworthy. The persona smiles, but the shadow mourns. And the longer this split continues, the heavier the burden becomes. What begins as a fracture of communication becomes a fracture of the self. To heal one must first see clearly these are not coincidences, not quirks, not minor flaws to be overlooked. They are mirrors. They show the reality of his intentions and the cost of ignoring them. And so the path begins with recognition. To see the fracture as fracture and not as something to be explained away. To admit that a relationship built on absence is not a relationship at all. This is painful, but it is the first movement toward wholeness. The soul calls us to notice these small signs, not so we may despair, but so we may protect our energy. Because every moment spent in a fractured bond is a moment lost from a fuller life. To honor these early warnings is to honor oneself. It is to step away from illusion and prepare for truth. When fractures remain unacknowledged, they do not stay small. They evolve into repeating patterns, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the relationship. At this stage, the bond may still appear intact to outsiders. Smiles are shared. Plans are spoken of, the outward persona of connection is maintained. Yet beneath the surface, the shadow grows stronger. The persona is what he shows: polite words, gestures of decency, a minimal presence that creates the illusion of involvement. But the shadow reveals itself in what is withheld: depth, constancy, and the courage to share his inner world. When a woman ignores this split, she becomes caught between image and truth, wondering why her heart feels empty, while appearances suggest she should feel content. Consider the man who continues to carry ties to his past. The persona insists it is harmless, only casual conversation, only respect for history. But the shadow is clear: indecision, unresolved longing, divided loyalty. The woman begins to sense she is not standing in the light of his commitment, but in the dim glow of unfinished business. She may deny it at first, but the feeling of being second choice lingers, quietly eroding her worth. Or look at the pattern of repeated cancellations. On the surface, the persona speaks of obligations, responsibilities, unforeseen demands. Yet the shadow speaks louder: disregard, avoidance, and lack of respect for her time. She adjusts her schedule, rearranges her life, only to find herself left waiting again. Outwardly, she smiles. Inwardly, she wonders if her presence matters. The persona soothes, but the shadow wounds. This duality extends to family and social circles. The persona may frame exclusion as protection or as a desire to take things slowly. But the shadow tells the truth: she is being kept apart, hidden, not woven into the fabric of his life. She may believe she is special, yet she remains invisible to the people who shape his world. The mask of decency hides the deeper message: I do not intend to keep you. Most painful of all is the closed heart. The persona engages in conversation, offers laughter, perhaps even intimacy of the body. But the shadow locks the door to true vulnerability. No fears, no dreams, no stories of the soul are ever shared. She reveals her depths, but he remains at the surface. This pattern teaches her subtly but powerfully that her openness will not be matched. The cost of living with such a split is profound. On one hand, she accepts the persona and tells herself, at least he is not unkind, at least he is not cruel. On the other hand, the shadow speaks to her in moments of silence. This is not enough. This is not love. The tension between mask and reality creates a double life. She becomes both the woman who smiles patiently and the woman who feels unseen. Jung wrote that the persona is a necessary mask, but when it hardens into the whole truth, the individual becomes a stranger to himself. Here, the mask becomes a prison, not only for the man, but also for the woman who engages with it. She is no longer relating to a whole person, but to a fragment, a facade that conceals the truth. And in doing so, she betrays her own wholeness by remaining within the performance. The shadow is not only his, it also awakens hers. She may find herself tolerating what she once swore she never would. She accepts vague communication, overlooks, neglect, rationalizes exclusion. Each time she bends, she silences the voice within that knows she deserves more. In this way, her shadow, the part of her that fears solitude, the part that doubts her value, grows stronger. This is the dangerous repetition of the pattern. She may have lived through a marriage where she gave endlessly and received little. She may have adapted for years to someone else's lack of effort until neglect itself began to feel normal. Now, when faced with another man who gives only fragments, her psyche recognizes the pattern, and instead of rejecting it, she unconsciously gravitates toward it because it feels familiar. Here lies the true conflict, the mask versus the authentic self. The persona of patience and understanding says, I can manage this, can make it work. The shadow whispers, you are repeating the same wound. When this inner split is not faced, the woman remains trapped between two realities, the hope of being chosen and the truth of being overlooked. The cost is not only emotional, it is spiritual. Each day, spent in such imbalance drains energy that could have been used for growth, for creativity, for genuine love. The self, the deeper center of the psyche, waits for recognition, waits for her to step out of the mask and back into authenticity. Yet the longer she denies the truth, the more disconnected she becomes from her own essence. It is important to see that these patterns are not random. They are choices. His choice not to open, not to include, not to prioritize. And her choice, conscious or unconscious, to accept it. This is not a moral judgment, but a psychological truth. The shadow thrives where awareness is absent. And until the mask is removed, the cycle repeats. This stage of the journey is painful because it forces us to see what we would rather not see. It reveals how we wear our own persona, The mask of patience, of gratitude, of endurance, even while the shadow within longs for truth. The woman tells herself she is strong because she tolerates, but strength built on denial is not strength. It is resignation. The deeper question arises here. What is the price of maintaining the mask? How much of the soul is surrendered when we pretend that neglect is acceptable? The answer comes quietly but firmly: too much. Every compromise against one's worth is a fracture in the self, and the self, unlike the persona, cannot be deceived. It knows when it is not being honored. In this way, the story of fractured patterns becomes the story of the soul's conflict between mask and essence, persona and shadow. To remain in denial is to lose energy, clarity, and dignity. To face the truth is to invite transformation. But before that awakening can arrive, the conflict must be felt fully endured without denial. And so we arrive at the threshold. The persona has been exposed. The shadow has spoken. The woman stands in the middle of the split, aware that something must change. This is the moment before awakening the painful clarity that illusion cannot continue forever. What comes next is the choice to see, to reframe, and to step toward individuation. Awakening often begins in silence. It comes in the still moments after another canceled plan, after another vague message, after another evening where the heart feels invisible. At first, the realization is painful, even unbearable. He is not uncertain, he has already chosen. His choice is distance withholding absence. The shock is not that the signs were hidden, but that they were always in plain view, and hope refused to see them. Jung reminded us that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is precisely what occurs in these relationships. The unconscious patterns of tolerating neglect, of accepting half measures, rise up again and again until one day they can no longer be denied. What felt like love is revealed as repetition, a replay of an older wound dressed in new clothing. The awakening is not only about him, it is also about her. She begins to recognize how her own shadow has been active. The fear of abandonment, the longing to be chosen, the belief that her worth is proven through patience. These hidden forces have shaped her responses, convincing her to wait, to rationalize, to silence the voice that whispered she deserved more. The first light of awareness shines here, exposing not just his patterns, but her own. This light is both liberating and frightening. To see the truth is to admit that the relationship was never whole. It was built on fragments, illusions, masks. Yet within this clarity lies great power. For the first time, she understands that nothing she could have done differently would have created love where there was only ambivalence. His choices reflect his inner state, not her value. The awakening reveals another paradox. What she feared most, solitude, begins to appear not as a curse, but as a gift. In solitude, she is not compared, not canceled, not hidden. In solitude, her energy is her own. Here she remembers that individuation, the journey toward becoming whole, requires separating from what is false. She cannot step into the fullness of herself while tethered to a man who cannot meet her there. Symbolically, this moment is like standing before a mirror, for the first time without distortion. She sees herself not as he reflected her, but as she truly is. The image is not perfect, but it is authentic, and authenticity is what the self has been waiting for. The mask of patience slips away, and the shadow is recognized as fear, not truth. This is where many women describe a deep shift. The exhaustion of guessing what he feels, of waiting for him to change, suddenly feels heavier than the risk of walking away. The burden of carrying the relationship alone is no longer worth the cost. In that moment, clarity arrives. She does not need to beg for love, prove her value, or compete with ghosts of the past. She only needs to return to herself. Jung spoke of individuation as a reconciliation with all parts of the psyche, light and dark, wounded and strong. This awakening is part of that reconciliation. She admits the pain of her shadow, the fear of rejection, the history of giving too much. But she also honors the strength of herself, the part that insists on dignity, wholeness, and real connection. By seeing both, she begins to integrate. The illusions fall away one by one. Lukewarm communication is no longer read as shyness, but as lack of interest. Attachment to an ex is no longer excused as civility, but seen as unfinished business. Repeated cancellations are no longer forgiven as busyness, but recognized as disregard. And his closed heart is no longer mistaken for mystery, but named for what it is: emotional unavailability. The mask has been removed. The awakening does not erase sadness. In fact, it often deepens it, because she realizes how much time and energy she has invested in something that was never real. Yet this sadness is clean, not corrosive. It is grief that clears space, not despair that consumes. The tears shed here are a form of release, a ritual of letting go of the illusion that he would one day become what she hoped for. In this way, the awakening becomes the threshold of transformation. The shadow is no longer denied. The persona is no longer believed. The self steps forward, insisting on clarity. She sees now that the relationship was never about her worth, but about his inability to meet her depth. And in that recognition, she stops fighting to be chosen. Instead, she begins to choose herself. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. The soul cannot thrive in half light. It requires wholeness, mutuality, respect. By awakening to what the fractures truly mean, she takes the first step toward this wholeness. The path is not yet easy, but it is true. And truth, however difficult, is the beginning of freedom. Awakening alone does not bring freedom. It opens the eyes. But the real shift comes when one acts differently. To see the fractures is one step. To refuse to keep walking across them is another. Awareness without action becomes stagnation, and the soul does not rest until change begins. At this stage, the woman reaches the turning point. She understands that waiting for him to change has only prolonged her pain. The question now is not what he will do, but what she will allow. Boundaries once feared as rejection now reveal themselves as protection. They are not walls to keep out love, but gates that guard dignity. Consider the simple act of withdrawing from one-sided communication. For months, she may have carried the dialogue, initiating messages, keeping the connection alive. Now, she chooses silence. She allows space to show what he will do in the absence of her effort. This silence is not punishment, but clarity. If he cares, he will step forward. If he disappears, the truth has spoken. Either way, she is no longer draining herself to sustain what does not sustain her. Or think of the cancellations. Each postponed meeting once left her waiting, hoping, excusing. Now the pattern meets consequence. She no longer accepts vague words like, "we'll see" or "maybe later." Instead, she states firmly, "When you are ready to set a time, let me know. Until then, I will make my own plans." In this way, her boundary transforms the dynamic. She refuses to be left in limbo. Her life continues on her terms. The same principle applies to exclusion from his world. Once, she rationalized being kept apart from his family or friends. Now, she speaks with clarity. "I notice our connection feels separated from the rest of your life. Is this temporary, or do you intend to keep it this way?" No blame, no anger, only truth. His response reveals his intent, and her decision flows from there. Even with the closed heart, she finds her own way to draw the line. Instead of endlessly waiting for him to open, she offers vulnerability herself. She shares something honest, personal, perhaps tender. If he meets her with depth, there is hope. If he turns away, the answer is plain. By showing what she seeks, she uncovers whether he is capable of meeting it. If he is not, she no longer deceives herself. Here lies the essence of boundaries. They are not demands that another must fulfill. They are declarations of what she will and will not accept. They are standards lived in action. Jung spoke often of individuation as the process of becoming who you are not, who others wish you to be. Each boundary is an act of individuation. It affirms, "This is what aligns with myself. Anything less does not belong." For many women, this stage feels frightening. To step back to risk losing him stirs old fears of abandonment. Yet this fear itself reveals the shadow at work. The unconscious has long believed that survival depends on keeping the connection alive, no matter the cost, and by setting a boundary, she exposes this illusion. She discovers that she does not disappear when she stops giving endlessly. She remains whole. In fact, she becomes more whole. Boundaries are not cold. They are not about punishing or controlling. They are warm acts of self-respect. They create the conditions in which genuine love can grow because they allow both partners to meet as equals. Without them, one gives while the other takes, and the imbalance corrodes the bond. With them, both must reveal their true intentions. The man who is serious will step into that clarity with gratitude. The one who is not will fall away. Either way, the woman is freed. Every choice she makes in this stage restores energy. Energy once lost in overthinking now returns to creativity. Hours once spent waiting in uncertainty become hours of peace, reflection, and growth. The soul once drained by constant guessing feels nourished by clarity. This is the hidden gift of boundaries. They do not only protect against harm, they restore vitality to the self. Jung observed that what we repress becomes fate. By refusing to repress her needs any longer, she shifts her fate. No longer repeating the cycle of neglect, she writes a new pattern: reciprocity, respect, authenticity. This shift may not change the man before her, but it changes her relation to him. And more importantly, it prepares her for a new connection, one in which she will no longer tolerate half light when her soul was made for full sun. In symbolic terms, the act of setting boundaries is like closing a door that has been left ajar for too long. The draft of uncertainty has chilled her spirit. By closing the door, she keeps warmth within. She does not lock herself away. She simply honors her inner space, allowing entry only to those who can walk with care. This image is not of withdrawal, but of stewardship. She is the keeper of her own inner home. The consequences of this shift ripple outward. Friends notice her strength. Children or family may see her modeling a new way of relating, one built not on silent endurance, but on clear self-respect. Even her future relationships are shaped by this moment. Once she has tasted the clarity of boundaries, she will never again confuse fragments for devotion. This is the heart of individuation. To live from the self rather than from fear, to honor one's worth in action rather than only in thought, to embody the truth that love cannot flourish where self-respect is absent. The woman who once settled for crumbs now chooses the feast. She no longer begs to be chosen because she has already chosen herself. This choice is not the end of longing. She still desires companionship, intimacy, partnership. But the longing is now directed toward what is real, not what is illusory. By closing the chapter on half measures, she opens the possibility of full-hearted love. Boundaries are not the end of romance. They are the soil in which real romance can grow. And so the path moves forward. From awakening comes choice. From choice comes action. From action comes freedom. The shadow is no longer guiding her steps. The persona of endless patience has been set aside. What remains is clarity, dignity, and readiness for love that reflects her whole self. In the final stage, clarity begins to settle like quiet light after a storm. The illusions have fallen away. The boundaries have been drawn, and what remains is the simple truth. She is worth more than fragments of affection. This realization does not come as a sudden burst of triumph. It comes as a calm recognition, a steady voice within that says, "I will no longer settle." The temptation, of course, is to look back and compare. Many women find themselves saying, "At least he was not cruel. At least he was not controlling." Yet this kind of downward comparison is a trap. It lowers the standard to the level of past wounds instead of raising it to the height of future dreams. Gratitude for basic decency should never replace the rightful expectation of love, respect, and reciprocity. Jung observed that the soul does not tolerate self-betrayal for long. When we accept too little, a quiet resentment builds in the unconscious, and eventually it demands to be heard. That is why relationships built on crumbs of attention always collapse in the end. The soul longs for wholeness, and wholeness cannot be achieved by pretending that half-hearted devotion is enough. To move beyond this pattern requires a new vision of love. Not the desperate hope of being chosen, not the relief of, "At least he is better than before," but the steady knowing that true partnership is possible. Real love is not dramatic or elusive. It is consistent, reciprocal, grounded. It includes you in the other's world. It honors your time, your presence, your heart. Here the lesson turns inward. The more she respects her own boundaries, the more she sends a message to life itself. This is what I am open to, and this is what I will not carry. Boundaries are not only about the man before her, they are about aligning her life with her deepest values. And when she holds those values firmly, she attracts those who can meet them. The shadow once feared now becomes a teacher. The fear of solitude, the longing to be chosen, the willingness to endure, neglect, all these were pieces of the unconscious asking for attention. By facing them, she no longer runs from her own depths. She learns that solitude is not emptiness, but sacred ground where the self gathers strength. Out of that strength, she can meet others as an equal, not as a beggar for love. This is the path of individuation. It is not about finding the perfect partner or erasing loneliness forever. It is about becoming whole, so that when love comes, it meets you at your full height. A man who is ready for this kind of love will not keep you in confusion. He will not cancel endlessly or hide you from his life, or keep his heart behind closed doors. He will step forward with clarity because he also seeks the same wholeness. And if such a man is not yet present, the soul still rests in peace, because it knows that by refusing to settle, it has already chosen truth over illusion. That choice is itself a form of love, love for the self. The symbol here is simple. Never mistake crumbs for a feast. Crumbs may quiet hunger for a moment, but they cannot sustain a soul that was made for abundance. To accept only fragments is to betray one's inner temple. But to insist on fullness is to honor the sacredness of one's life. As this reflection draws to a close, carry this with you. The greatest shift happens not when he finally sees your worth, but when you no longer question it. His blindness is his loss. Your clarity is your liberation. So trust your intuition. Respect your time. Walk away from what drains you and make space for what nourishes you. The love you deserve is not rare or imaginary. It is simply the natural meeting of two mature souls who are both willing to give fully and receive fully. And now I invite you to pause and reflect. Which part of this journey spoke most deeply to you? Share your thoughts in the comments if you wish. It may help someone else who is walking the same path. Remember this final truth. Individuation is not about perfection, but about integration. When you honor both your light and your shadow, when you refuse to betray yourself for the comfort of illusion, you step into the wholeness that has always been waiting. That wholeness is your true home, and from it, every real connection will flow.